everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Thanks so much for joining another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And today we're really delighted to be joined by one of the leading historians in the United States today, Drew Gilpin Faust, who is also the author of a terrific memoir that came out earlier this year called Necessary Trouble, growing up at Midcentury. We really look forward to talking about this terrific book. A little bit about Drew. She grew up in Virginia, Northern Virginia, in Clark County, which is not too far from Winchester in the Shenandoah Valley. She attended Bryn Mawr College and then has graduate degrees from the University of Pennsylvania, where she taught for many years. She was the founding dean of the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study, and then served as president of Harvard from 2007 to 2018. She has written a number of really terrific books. In fact, I was looking at a couple essays in which they list the top Civil War books of all time, and two of Drew's books are cited. The first one is called Mothers of Invention, Women of the Slaveholding South in the American Civil War. And the other one is called, and I have this on my bookshelf, This Republic of Suffering, which came out a few years ago, won all sorts of plaudits, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and several other really prestigious prizes, won a number of prizes on its own, and is just a really powerful and terrific book. She is also does some magazine writing as a contributing editor to The Atlantic, and has a really important essay in the current edition, the December edition of the Atlantic, which deals with Civil War issues. So we are really delighted to spend time with Drew, and she's joining us from her office in Cambridge. So good afternoon, Drew.
Good afternoon. It's very nice to be with you.
Thank you. Well, Drew, in terms of writing a memoir, I've talked to a number of people who've written memoirs, and they tend to kind of skew on poles. Some have described it as just a kind of an exhilarating, uplifting experience. Others have described it as exhausting and just depleting. Obviously, those are the two extremes, but in that continuum, how did you find writing a memoir?
Well, I wrote most of this during the pandemic. And so I think it had a very special environment in that here I was in my house with my husband for months on end, and I would just disappear into this task of putting together this book and writing the book. So in some ways, it was a lifeline. It gave me a project and something to take me away from the daily horrors of the pandemic. But I also really enjoyed the part of it that was so close to my experience as a historian. I think of the book as a kind of history memoir because I did a lot of research about what was going on around me as I was growing up, not just my own life. And so making the connections between the history and my own life was really exciting for me. And I enjoyed digging more deeply into 20th century history, which has not been my main area of focus.
Oftentimes, when it comes to memoirs, there's something of a tension maybe between telling your story, and in this case putting together a historical document. I know you work with memoirs in your work. Was there ever a kind of a tension where you're saying, when you're thinking, okay, I'm telling my story and then I'm also telling something that will be a document that can be useful to future historians?
Well, I thought it was important not to ever think of myself as representative of anything in particular, but rather somebody who was making a particular path through a time and a set of circumstances that illuminated and both opened and closed ways of moving forward for me. And so I wanted to just say to my readers, here I am, one person, here's how I saw choices, here's how I saw the world around me. And I hope you can see that world a little better, and also by seeing that world, see me a little better. So that it was almost the parallels between the insight into my own life and I hope the insight into the historical moment. So I think that I approached it in a way that each would reinforce the other rather than detract from one another.
In your acknowledgments, you I think put out a word of praise to your agent, and you said he encouraged and pushed me in ways that transformed the original project. How did the project change as it unfolded?
Well, I should say my agent was great, but that comment was about my editor, Jonathan
Okay.
Galassi. So I want to give credit to where credit's due, and I think he's the one who pushed me. I originally thought of the project as perhaps a series of vignettes, just moments in my life in the 50s and 60s that would stand next to each other, but somewhat independent of one another. And I didn't imagine a real narrative arc. But as I began writing and thinking about it and working through it and being in constant conversation with my editor, there emerged a different mode of approaching it, which is it is a story, and each chapter flows into the next, and there is a kind of overarching set of messages or approaches that come through in the book. Themes, I guess, is a better word. Themes that come through in the book, and that was in no small part due to the reactions from my editor as I was writing and pushing to say, can you relate what you said here to what you're saying now? He also, and this I wanted very much, I mean, one of the things my agent Andrew Wiley did do was I said to him at the very beginning, I want an editor who's going to be very involved. I've never really worked with an editor very closely. I've not had editors who were all that deeply involved in the construction or even in the um, commenting on a project. But I knew I was moving into a different realm, which is memoir writing rather than academic historical writing. So I wanted somebody who'd be involved. So Andrew Wiley put me in touch with Jonathan Galassi, who and at Farrar Straus Giroux, and that's who published the book. And Jonathan throughout kept saying, you've got to make this more personal. I want to know more about you. You are the link that ties all of this together. This is a memoir. Tell me more, tell me more. And so that was a big part of his impact, was just pushing me to do a different kind of writing than I had ever done.
About a month ago on campus, we had Richard Russo, the novelist, and he has written a memoir. And during one of the Q&A, someone was asking him about it, and he said it was, one of the most challenging writing experiences in his life because, he was committed to telling the truth, or the truth as he knew it, but it also involved, a complicated story, particularly with his mother. And so he felt both the kind of impulse to tell the truth, but also, a loyalty to her, even though she had passed. And I know in this book, I mean, you write about your parents very respectfully, but also candidly about some of the differences. I mean, did you also, when you were writing the memoir, kind of feel that tension that Russo describes?
Not so much. I wanted to be fair. I didn't, I mean, both my parents are dead. My father died, my mother died in 1966. My father died in 2000. So they've been dead quite a long time. And I didn't feel that I needed to worry about their judgment, but I wanted to be even handed. And I hoped that my brothers would, I have three brothers, would let me tell my story, which they did. And there may be places that they disagree or would like to dispute what I said, but they have been respectful of my right to tell the story as I saw it. So I didn't feel particularly pressed by the notion of having to please an audience of immediate family.
Okay. Well, let's talk about just sort of the heart of the story. I mean, you grew up in the segregated South in Virginia, and one of the sort of themes that comes out is the Virginia way, its own kind of specific way of handling America 1950s in the South. Talk about the Virginia way as you experienced it.
Well, it's a phrase that is often capitalized. It was advanced by Douglas Southall Freeman, the Lee biographer and a journalist in Richmond, and other journalists and political figures in Richmond in the 1950s, about how Virginia approached race. And the notion was that Virginia was going to be more genteel in a way than the Deep South, that the signs of segregation would not be as vividly confrontational as they were in the Deep South, that instead segregation and white supremacy would be enforced as Douglas Ethel Freeman and others argued, through a kind of consent that they expected from the Black population, so that there would not be the violent confrontations that were a part of, such a central part of enforcing racial hierarchies in the Deep South. So that this sense that race relations were just fine in Virginia, the white sense that they were just fine, because African Americans in Virginia had supposedly consented to this subordinate position. Now, of course, Black Virginians had not in any way consented to being second-class citizens and second-class human beings. And that became abundantly clear as the civil rights movement gained momentum and Brown v. Board required the integration of schools and so forth. So that Virginia was pressed, as all of the South and indeed all of the nation was, by these changing views about race. But the effort to establish a kind of ideology of peaceful supremacy was very much a part of Virginians' approach to race relations. I grew up in a county in Virginia in the Shenandoah Valley that was about 20%, a little more than 20% Black during much of my childhood, between say 17, 21%, depending which census you look at. And that hierarchy was very much in place where I grew up. There were African Americans in the community. Almost all of them worked for white people as domestics or farm laborers. The schools were segregated. The Old South was very much in action, but you didn't see signs saying white people only, or this water fountain is for white people only. Instead, there were customs that were just understood to be as they were. And the compliance was more by common understanding than it was by any kind of evident violent enforcement. And so that was very much in keeping with the notion of the Virginia way that had been advanced by individuals like Freeman and others in Richmond.
Okay, I want to read a couple sentences from your memoir and have you reflect on it. You said, "For many white Southerners of my generation, a life-defining question has been how long it took us to notice the contradictions between the democratic and Christian ideals intoned in church and school and the patterns of injustice in which our lives were embedded. When did the contradictions become troubling? When did they become unbearable? What was the moment of epiphany, the circumstance that made the inconsistencies undeniable? When did it become imperative to confront the legacies of slavery and segregation?" Develop that if you would, Drew.
Well, for me, that moment came when I was 9 years old and I was driving home from school, being driven by an African-American man who worked for my father. And it was in 1957, in the aftermath of the Brown v. Board Supreme Court decision that schools must be integrated. And Virginia was going through the throes of coming to terms with that decision. And essentially, white Virginia political leaders were coming to terms with how they were going to resist that decision. And the policy that was put forward by Senator Harry Byrd and supported by many white political figures in the state was that they would advance a policy of, quote, massive resistance, by which they meant closing the schools rather than integrating them. So there was a lot of conversation suddenly about race in Virginia, whereas the kinds of compliance that I was talking about a moment ago really operated through silence and innuendo rather than overt conversation or confrontations about race. But suddenly this conversation became overt, became loud. And I overheard on the radio a debate that made me realize that integration was against the law, that segregation was the law of the land, and that my white school was white, not by chance, but by law and by design. And I asked this African-American man who was driving the car, is that true that my school is all white because of the law? And he didn't say anything. And then I said, is it true that if I made my face black, I couldn't go to school tomorrow? Again, he didn't say anything. And that silence to me was, even as a 9-year-old, revelatory. And I suddenly realized that I had been told all kinds of things that weren't true and not told all kinds of other things that were true, and that all these principles of democracy and Christianity and fairness were not operating in the world in which I lived. And I was really upset and outraged. I was outraged on two levels. One, this wasn't fair. How could the world work like this? And secondly, why hadn't anyone told me? And who was betraying me by not telling me the truth? So that was my moment of epiphany, as a white Southerner, suddenly realizing that the world operated in a way that was very different from what I'd been previously led to think. So I went home and I sat down and I wrote a letter to President Eisenhower urging that he support integration, talking about these religious and democratic values, and sent this off to the president. And then in 2003, I believe it was, I found the letter after I asked the Eisenhower Library to please look for it. And there it was, under the auspices of the National Archives of the United States, my little block lettered missive ordering the president to do what I thought he ought to do.
Well, Julie, in your memoir, you talk about one of the just really powerful forces shaping your life has been reading. And I want to read a couple sentences and have you expand. You said, I found few things more fun than reading. I read not to break records, but for pleasure, for company, and for escape. As I grew older, I read to look beyond my contained Virginia worlds and to be able to see it through different eyes. Books enabled me to explore lives and to imagine myself into them, lives that went beyond the limited choices available to my mother and the women of her circle. My role models had to come from the world of books. And particularly, and you have an absolutely amazing chapter, which I loved, about the power of reading, but particularly you focused on three: Nancy Drew, Anne Frank, her diary, and Scout, the iconic figure in To Kill a Mockingbird. So talk about reading more broadly, and then particularly these three young ladies that you encountered and how they helped kind of shape your view of what your possibilities were.
Well, I loved reading from the time I was very small, and I had little golden books, and I thought those were just wonderful. And I tried to get new ones all the time. And I found increasingly in reading that I could move beyond this very limited world in which I lived. Now, it was limited in a lot of ways. It was a rural, I didn't live in a city, I lived on a farm, and I didn't interact with the wider world very often. But I also lived in a place where all the women of my mother's circle, as was suggested in the little excerpt you read, worked in the home. They were housewives, mothers, wives. And that was the extent of what they did. I knew almost no women in my mother's circle who were in the workforce. And so I didn't have any model of, I didn't know a lady doctor, I didn't know a lady business person, I didn't know a woman lawyer. There was no one to say, okay, I want to be like that person. And so I began to see, as I read, examples of women who'd done very extraordinary and daring things. And some of those examples came through little capsule biographies of Susan B. Anthony or Clara Barton or other women in American history. But there were three sets of books that, or one was a series and other two individual books, that had a powerful effect on me in the way they portrayed young women, in fact. And one of these was the Nancy Drew series. And I know I am not alone in being influenced by her independence and courage. She's a favorite of people like Nancy Pelosi and Oprah Winfrey and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and other, Hillary Clinton, lots of women who have moved into positions of influence and accomplishment cite Nancy Drew as an influence. And Nancy Drew, was admirable in my view because she could seem to do anything. She could decipher codes and change tires and find secrets and so forth. But also, justice was always done at the end. So this accomplishment was very satisfying because she always did right and turned things right in the world. So that was an inspiration. And then the second book I write about in my chapter is The Diary of Anne Frank, which I picked up in a bookstore, I believe because on the cover of the particular edition I had, it said, A Diary of Adolescence. And from the time I was 9 or 10, I was just so eager to be an adolescent. I wanted to grow up and be older than I was, as I think many children do. And I believe I was attracted to the Anne Frank diary because it was going to be about that. And I think I was 10 or 11 when I read it. And of course, she is so reflective about what she wants her life to be and how she wants to have a role in the world and an impact on the world. And she wants to be a writer. And all the time here she is in these unspeakable circumstances, in what must have been states of high anxiety, and her bravery and courage and aspirations in face of that were inspiring to me. And I didn't know anything about the Holocaust until I read this book, and I didn't read it because it was about the Holocaust, but I sure learned about a whole other world in which someone could do something beyond my imagining in face of the threats that she encountered. And of course, her death was so tragic and so upsetting to me as a young child that only reinforced the power of that book in my mind. And then the third individual that I write about in the chapter is Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird. And I know there are many arguments and criticisms about To Kill a Mockingbird these days, and I understand all of them. They're very much the book is very much from the point of view of white Southerners, and that's what it is. But Scout to me represented something so important in that as a young child, she seemed to be able to free herself, at least in the context of that book, from many of the assumptions of her society, and to say, I, Scout, am not going to succumb to the expectations that are being imposed on me. And those expectations included things like wearing dresses and being a lady, which that kind of pressure I identified with very strongly because that was expected of me. But she also hoped to free herself from a lot of the racial assumptions of her society. And there's, of course, the very famous moment when she stands on the courthouse and steps and basically deflects a lynch mob from going after the African-American man that her father is defending in a rape case. And her standing up there in front of this mob and showing that kind of courage, to me, represented something bigger than just her story, but the story of, in some ways, what is required of all of us in a society where race has been such a source of inequity and oppression. And so I felt Scout was a girl who dared, just as Anne Frank and Nancy Drew were girls who dared. And so I ask in the course of the book, can I be a girl who dares too? And that was the message they sent to me. Dare you dare, you know, we charge you. Can you do it? So that came out of books for me.
Well, I want to read a couple sentences on Nancy Drew, which I really loved. And I had not realized just what a dynamo she was, but you said she was accomplished at everything. She could pick locks, pilot a speedboat, sew, paint, execute necessary chemical analyses, change tires, repair cars, analyze handwriting. Perhaps it was Nancy Drew who persuaded us we could have it all. Then you go on to say the original Nancy Drew left me with a narrative for a female life I had not known before, but I had not encountered before, a story in which a girl could do almost anything, wielded her power in the cause of truth and justice. So
that's Nancy Drew.
Well, as someone who came into your life who was not a bad follow-up to Nancy Drew, was a woman who was a powerful force in your high school, Concord Academy, and that is Mrs. Hall. Talk a little bit about Mrs. Hall. She was a large figure in your book.
She was a large figure in my life too. I got sent to an all-girls school in Massachusetts just as I turned 13. And I came out of a world in Virginia, where to be a smart girl was a problem. They didn't kind of know what to do with me. You referred to, I didn't mean to break records with my reading. My school thought I read too much, that this was not appropriate. I ought to divert myself into other occupations. But when I got to this school in Massachusetts, it was just fuel for my intellectual life and a world in which women ruled. And the most powerful of these women was the head of school, Elizabeth Hall. And she was a little like Nancy Drew. You're right. She drove a tractor to build a skating rink. She mobilized a whole group of people to go to New Hampshire and take down an old meeting house board by board and bring it back to Concord and assemble it on the school grounds. And she wasn't just standing there telling other people what to do. She was on the ladder nailing in the roof. And that was who she was. She also got up and gave us inspirational speeches about the meaning of life twice a week, and we hung on her every word. And she charged around the school, organizing everybody and everything, followed by this trail of mutts that she adopted, and they were always in her thrall, as were we. And so to see her operate in the world was just so revelatory, and to have her be the representative of what we should be, but also what our minds ought to do, and what learning meant and what school meant. For me, as a really avid student, that was mesmerizing.
You describe her as a combination of Socrates and George Patton. Uh,
Yep, I think that's apt.
and you also you talk about the school you went to, Concord, and just the way that it really kind of engaged your intellectual capacities. And you said something really kind of interesting. You say, "I was blessed not to grow up in the era of grade inflation." You're talking about the rigors of the school. Expand on that a bit.
Well, we were given, and this was true in college as well. I went to Bryn Mawr, and in both circumstances, you just about never, ever, ever got an A. And when you got an A, you were so thrilled, and you knew you had exceeded yourself. You had done something that was so notable that maybe you were going to publish it or something. It was so good. And you didn't all the time feel disappointed when you didn't get an A. You felt thrilled when you did, but not devastated when you didn't. And you strove for that A. I felt for the last number of years, and that's many years now, teaching students at both Penn and at Harvard, that the A is what they feel they have to have, and anything short of that is a failure on some level. And if they do something truly remarkable, there's no way for the faculty member to really acknowledge it in a grade. So it's a kind of, I think in some ways, all lose situation with grading right now, that it doesn't enable us to really communicate to students outside these assumptions that they have, that only an A is an acceptable grade, and anything less than that is falling short significantly. I mean, I would think often in my high school and college life, a B plus, wow, okay, not too bad. I mean, I can do better, and next time I will, and the time after that I'll do even better. So it left a path for aspiration and a path for learning in a way. But when I did get one of those A's, wow, that was so special. I knew I'd improved. I knew I'd achieved something really great. And I was so proud, even though I didn't necessarily think I was going to get an A the next time. I knew I had to do it all over again and maybe be even better. I don't know. Does that make sense as a
It
comparison?
does. Yeah, it absolutely does. Well, I mean, reading we've talked about is how that expanded your world, but you also had this remarkable trip. I think it was in the summer of 1963, in which, in the course of just a couple months, you and a relatively small group of students traveled some 7,000 miles in East and West Germany, Czechoslovakia, and what was then Yugoslavia. And talk about that experience and how that just helped expand your world.
Well, maybe I should say a word about how it happened that I went. It really was an outgrowth of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which occurred in the fall of 1962. And I can remember sitting around in an empty classroom, probably 9 o'clock at night at Concord, with 6 or 7 of my friends, talking about how the world was going to end. And this was all the life we were going to get, and what did we regret that wouldn't happen to us. And we were pretty terrified. And on some level, you might say, oh, that's young women being rather hysterical or overstating things. But in fact, we now know that we were being all too realistic, and that it was very close to the brink that America came in that moment to nuclear war. But I had such a reaction to that moment that when I came across a flyer saying that a Quaker group was going to be organizing this travel trip to Eastern Europe so that young people from both sides of the Iron Curtain could speak to one another across their national divides and across the divides of communism and capitalism to try to bring forth a peaceful world, I thought, I want to do this. I want to do something in face of what we confronted last fall in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I went on this trip, and I knew from the beginning that it was going to be an integrated trip with African American participants. And I had never before in my life been in a place where I lived in a community of equality and intimacy with African Americans. And so to have 3 of the 9 members of this trip be African American was also something completely new for me. So both the Cold War, in terms of our crossing over through Checkpoint Charlie and going behind the Iron Curtain, but also the world of changing race relations was very much a part of this summer for me. And so on every level, it was transformative in that I saw different ways of operating in the world and a different way of living my life. I also loved sitting down with young people and just arguing and talking and disagreeing and learning from each other and seeing other people's perspectives, even if you didn't ultimately agree with them. And so that whole mode of interaction and questioning and curiosity was so thrilling to me that I thought, I want to figure out a way to spend maybe my whole life asking questions and meeting people not like me and expanding my brain and my universe in the way I had that summer.
Well, your book is really remarkable in talking about just how the civil rights cause just animated you ever since as a young girl. And you described, I think maybe it was 63, I think you're still in high school, driving some distance to, I think it was Groton, to watch Martin Luther King give a speech, give a talk. And then several years later, 1965, when the Selma crisis was unfolding, you drove some 1,000 miles from Philadelphia down to Selma to participate in that march. Talk about just, how this powerful push to be active in the civil rights cause enveloped your life, really.
Well, much of what I thought when I was 16 or 18 or 28 or even now came from the kinds of perceptions that I described to you a few moments ago that I had when I was 9 years old. And I suddenly realized how unfair the world was. And for me, the refrain, "It's not fair," was one that appeared constantly in my childhood. I think because of the 3 brothers who were allowed to do things I wasn't, because my mother's saying it's a man's world, get used to it. And I just wanted to say all the time, it's not fair, it's not fair. And that's what I said to President Eisenhower in that letter in 1957. It's not fair. That's what bothered me when I went to Selma, was watching the Bloody Sunday films on television of African Americans protesting to get the vote and having their heads bashed in, John Lewis bleeding on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. That was profoundly not fair. And it was also, as my perceptions revealed to me when I was much younger, it was also at odds with everything we said we believed. And so the hypocrisy of saying that we believe in American democracy, we embrace the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, we are Christian, which my family was, not, observant, not avidly Christian, but we believe in Christian doctrine, the golden rule, and then to behave in the way that American racial structures prescribed in the 1960s. I couldn't stand the hypocrisy of it. And so I felt, if I'm going to stand up for honesty, if I'm going to stand up for what I believe, if I'm going to stand up for truth, I have to do something. And when I was 9, that was right to Eisenhower. When I was a freshman at Bryn Mawr College, it was borrow a car and go to Selma and bear witness, as Martin Luther King had urged all Americans to do.
And you also became active with the Students for a Democratic Society. I don't know if that's the precise term, which the Port Huron statement and all. So, but I think that I was struck too, Drew, in your book. You point out really well that you had these powerful civil rights movement. You also had a very strong and important anti-war efforts, and both of them were powerful forces in American life. But both of these movements splintered too, and I think you found yourself trying to navigate your way through that, because I mean you were very much for the peaceful resistance approach, but became troubled, particularly when some of these movements had factions that extolled violence. I mean, talk about watching those important movements splinter and how you try to navigate that.
Well, Selma has often been called the high water mark of the civil rights movement because even at Selma, John Lewis marched. He was president of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and he marched at Selma in contravention of the wishes of SNCC, who thought that these peaceful marches were no longer accomplishing anything, that Black power was the mode, that the movement had to be taken over by African Americans, and there wasn't place really for white people in the movement. So that after Selma, the movement really did split, and at one point after that, John Lewis was removed from his leadership role at SNCC. Martin Luther King was marginalized in the movement to a considerable degree. And it was not obvious where a white person like me who wanted to participate should or could go. So the civil rights movement split. And then in the anti-war movement, which kind of took up my interest and commitment in the years after my freshman year and my Selma episode at Bryn Mawr College, that too split towards the 1968, towards the end of my college years, as once again, protesters against the war became very impatient with what they saw as so little accomplished, and with the continuing escalation of the war, and especially with the fact that in the 1968 election, even though Gene McCarthy had run so strongly against the war in the primaries with student support, and then even though Bobby Kennedy seemed like a really good champion for the anti-war cause, and then he was shot. So by the fall of 1968, there is no anti-war candidate running for president. And a lot of students just said, peaceful protest isn't going to do it. And they became very much more active in a more confrontational way. And some people I knew joined the Weather Underground and did turn to violence as a way of demonstrating the force of their conviction that the war must be stopped. I, by temperament, have never been a violent person. I also think that the Quaker path that led me into social activism certainly precluded violence. It was a set of beliefs, ideologies, and commitments that were very closely aligned with the nonviolence of Martin Luther King, but not with what became the more confrontational tactics, both within the civil rights and anti-war movements. So that these splinters happened in both those instances, but they were not paths for me. My path remained one that was looking for a peaceful way, a nonviolent way in which to bring about social change.
Well, you summarize that succinctly, and you're right. One of my greatest challenges as an activist was probably that I was too polite for the revolution. Drew, let's talk about,
doesn't it?
let's talk about your passion for history and your enormous accomplishments in the realm of history. And you write in your memoir, you said, what has always captured me intellectually was a broad sweep of ideas and social forces. Coming to terms with the past would ultimately become an intellectual and professional commitment, as well as a personal necessity. I grew up to be a historian. Reflect on that.
Well, as you were reading that, I was thinking that in some ways my becoming a historian was, as they say, overdetermined, because I grew up in a place in which history was so vividly present. In rural Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley, I was on land that the battles of Civil War had been fought on, pathways that Stonewall Jackson and Philip Sheridan had ridden back and forth over. the Civil War was alive in the place I grew up in. We used to play Civil War as kids. The Civil War centennial was approaching, and various people I knew were preparing to take part in various reenactments or observances of the Civil War centennial. And the issues of race that were essentially a part of that whole era, an essential part of that whole era, were still being reflected in the battles over Brown v. Board and integration. So one could hardly doubt that the past didn't matter in a place like that where the past was still present. And I remember my grandmother used to refer to General Sherman as if he were someone she'd known. She'd say, "Oh, what an unattractive man." She was from Tennessee. And it was as if they'd gone out on a date or something. And so it took me a while to figure out that Sherman was long dead by the time my grandmother came along, because time seemed to be conflated and congealed by the presence of the past. So I was always very well aware of history's importance in the present. And I don't know, I sometimes wondered when I was president of Harvard whether I came to problems with the eye of a historian because I'd been a practicing PhD trained historian for so long, or if I'd become a PhD trained historian because I approach problems in that way. But always, as president, I'd always say, where did this problem come from? What's the origin of it? And people just got to around me got to know, she's going to want to know the history of this problem, because I felt before I addressed it, I wanted to know what had come before. And that's just how I see the world. I always ask that question, even when I'm not being self-consciously a historian. I'm a historian in my bones.
Well, I've heard you describe yourself as a Southern historian, and of course, that refers to a region, but is a Southern historian, apart from a different region, different than a Northern historian? Are there a set of questions that maybe intrigue and animate you that maybe would not be generally the case among the broader historical profession?
It's such an interesting question that you'd ask that, because the meaning of Southern historian has changed significantly in the course of my professional career. I got my PhD in 1975, and the question of the North and the South and how different were they one from another, and was there a distinctive South, that was very much at play. And the South was seen as somewhat backward still. It was just beginning to integrate. It was a place apart. It's economically was depressed compared to the rest of the nation. And yet in the years that have followed, there's been such a transformation in the nature of the relationship between North and South. I think we've noticed, it was also, the South was the site of racial oppression and inequality. We've noticed so much more about the North, both historically and in the present, as a place where racial injustice also has thrived. We recognize as historians how much slavery had a foothold in the North, first because slavery existed in the North well into the 19th century, but also because even after that, the North profited so greatly from investments in slavery. So North and South have become to seem in many ways much less distinct and much less differentiated. And then we have, of course, the phenomenon of the Sun Belt and the enormous economic growth in the South in the years since 1975. So I began my career as a historian of the American South with a notion of the very great distinctiveness of the American South. And my first number of writings were about that world, and particularly before the Civil War. And then I moved into writing much more about the war itself, where the South was defined in considerable part by the white South's creation of a nation, the Confederacy. And then obviously this book is completely different from anything I've written before, but I'd say that I've become less a Southern historian than a historian of war and of the Civil War over the years. And that to be a Southern historian now is a different matter from being a historian of the South in 1975 when I got my PhD.
Well, Drew, one of your books that I want to read is your biography of James Henry Hammond, who you describe as the biographer's dream. Tell us a little bit about him, and particularly maybe broaden it out. I know academic historians are sometimes a little skeptical about the art of biography, and or maybe the limitations of biography, they would say. But tell us how, I mean, Hammond, who he was, but particularly what a study of him told you about the particular area that you're so interested in.
Oh, that's so great that you're asking about this book. It's more than 40 years old now. He was a biographer's dream because he kept everything. And he even wrote down things that you just couldn't believe he was writing down about enslaved women with whom he had children and who he kept in long-term relationship with him, about his nieces who he, in some way, the details, the kind of physical details aren't exactly clear, but he in some way sexually abused them so that none of them ever married. There was a great scandal that surrounded this, and he did it while he was governor. So he wrote down all kinds of amazing things about himself, but it also included things like complete records of his plantation, so that I could, all the birth and death records of his enslaved workers. So I could recreate family ties and links and generations. I could trace illness patterns. Hammond himself didn't do this, but he left me the wherewithal to see things that he didn't even see himself, so that I could look back in the past and find these. He was a South Carolina congressman, then a senator. He was often thought of as a possible candidate, presidential candidate, but he resigned from the Senate at the time of Lincoln's election and the beginnings of secession. He died in 1864, so he never really saw the end of the war and what came after it. He just left an extraordinary story of somebody who was so ambitious. He came from no wealth at all, married an heiress in Charleston, but he plotted out every path that would bring him to the pinnacle of white Southern society before the Civil War. So as you watch him plot this out, it's possible to sort of plot out yourself what he identified as the foundations of power in that society, and through his eyes to see how that society operated. And at the same time, have a window into the life of a man who was, to be frank, entirely despicable. He is not a biographer's dream because he's someone you want to admire, quite the opposite. And yet to try to understand how he saw his world was fascinating to me. And it gave me a window into a time and a place, South Carolina before the Civil War, that is unique in our history. There's a South Carolinian who, when South Carolina seceded, it was the first state to withdraw from the Union in 1860. This South Carolina politician who opposed secession said, South Carolina is too small for a country and too big for an insane asylum. And that's kind of how he characterized the uniqueness of this state. And so I think James Henry Hammond embodies much of what that society was about.
As you were talking, I was thinking of an essay Barbara Tuchman wrote about writing history, and she said something like, "Research is endlessly seductive. Writing is hard work." I mean, one of the pillars of your work is the fact that you are this amazingly dogged and relentless researcher, asking really creative questions, drawing linkages, but also are a wonderful writer. I mean, I wonder for you, is the research the really easy, fun part, and then the writing the harder work, or how does that unfold for you?
Well, I really love both parts in different ways. I love the researching because you discover things. It's like treasure hunting, and you'll stumble on something and see it, and just you're thrilled. You want to run down the stairs and tell somebody. You just are so excited about it. And I could be tempted to just keep doing research because it's so rich and so rewarding. The hardest thing, I think, is the blank screen. Used to be the blank pad, but now the blank screen, and getting the draft. But once there's a draft, even if it's super rough, I love playing with it. That's a delight, and thinking, oh, this should go here and that should go there, and let me tweak this, and oh, I need to say that. Once you have something to work with, it's really fun. That middle step of getting all your research organized in a way that you write a draft. That's the hardest.
Let's talk for a couple minutes about just the historical profession and where it is now, because it seems like, history books are really popular, but many of them are written by people who are not necessarily trained historians, a lot of journalists, et cetera. And I mean, there's been, a sort of a view that historians have oftentimes gotten kind of pulled down into their own language and writing to each other. And I want to read a couple sentences from an essay I just came across from John McNeill, who was, I think he's a professor at Georgetown. I think he was then president of the American Historical Association. He wrote this just a couple years ago, and I wonder if it resonates with you. He says, I'm 64 and finished my PhD in 1981. My generation of historians is, I hope, leaving a legacy of good work. But we are also leaving a blight on the craft of history. We pioneered, or at least normalized, the use of relentlessly abstract and obscure prose, often an imitation of models once current in literary criticism and philosophy. I consider that practice undemocratic, unhelpful to the prospects for our discipline, and a poor example for smart but impressionable students. Now, I should add, no one has accused you of writing like that, but as you survey the profession, do you have concerns that academic historians are writing too much to themselves and not to the broader public?
There are a lot of very respected, admired academic historians who are writing wonderful books for the public at large. So I do think that is seen as more acceptable than it used to be, more widespread. A desire for a general audience is something that doesn't raise eyebrows in the faculty amongst other faculty members. So I think it's valued and often imitated. But I would also argue that it's very important that people do the dogged-legged, just get in the archives and slug it out. And that means sometimes a book takes 10 years, 12 years. Your author who writes constant New York Times bestsellers has them coming up, every couple of years. You don't spend a decade or more working on a particular project. So I think it's very important that historians do that deep work in archival materials and continue to address questions and realities that may not make it to the bestseller list of the New York Times. There was a time when a lot of theory was central to literary criticism, and it was adopted by historians. And I think history has learned a lot about how to think about historians have learned a lot about how to think about what they do, but that has not been very attractive, as you say, to broader audiences. But I think nevertheless, a good bit of it has had a salutary influence on how historians criticize themselves, frame problems, challenge one another, and that's fine and appropriate for them to do that to one another. And as long as they do at the same time maintain this deep commitment to intensive research in materials that are revelatory of the past, and that we have some number of people who are translating all of that to a broader public that can take advantage of what historians have uncovered.
And this is a small point, but I noted that at Penn, I think you taught, or your degree was in American civilization, and I think you also chaired a department called that. And I know other schools have used the term American Studies. Is that just kind of a small semantic difference, or is there something deeper, a deeper dispute about what actually is being studied, the difference between American civilization and American studies?
The department in which I was trained at Penn was unusual in that it conceptualized American civilization around anthropology and how an anthropologist might transfer their interest to the past, so that we had graduate courses called, for example, when I joined the department, I took courses in that department, then I joined the department. I taught a course called an ethnography of antebellum South Carolina. And so that department was very much more focused on anthropology than many American studies departments that were focused on the relationship between history and literature. And I believe that the founders of the AmCiv department at Penn chose civilization to reflect the anthropological bent that they were following. But no one really battled over the names. It was more the emphases within the AmCiv program and what its faculty came to embody over time.
Okay. Well, final question. If you were stranded on a desert island and maybe, or
Oh,
had a long sabbatical and you had, 6 months just to read for fun, pleasure, history, fiction, whatever. I mean, what if you could just have fun for reading for 6 months, where would you go?
that's such a hard question. I have so many piles of books all over my house. Um, I like reading about war. The Civil War and other wars fascinate me. I've just finished an essay about World War I, actually, an introduction for a new edition of Jeffrey Dyer's The Missing of the Somme. So I'm very much in the war stories mode. I also love reading fiction, and I'm in the middle of a couple of fiction books. I'm reading Teju Cole's Tremor right now, a new novel that he's written, and I don't know what I'm going to read next. So I don't know exactly what I'd take to a desert island. It'd probably be equivalent to what I take when I go out to the Cape for the summer, and the pile of novels and histories that I've accumulated in the course of the year would be the same as a desert island, perhaps.
Great. Well, the final question, this is one I have to ask you. Your memoir concludes in 1968. I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, is there going to be a volume 2? President Obama divided his life into two books. Are you thinking of a subsequent memoir or an additional one?
I'm really not. This is the end of the memoir business for me. It was an effort to write about a time and a place, Virginia, growing up, what it meant to try to become a person in those years and to confront the kinds of change that those years represented. That was the story I wanted to tell, not necessarily the extended story of my life, but my life in those times. And so I'll stop with 1968.
Okay, great. Well, Drew, thank you so much for really a wonderful conversation. And I really recommend for people who are looking for Christmas gifts for family and friends, I would recommend this book. It's really a terrific read, and it provides just a remarkable perspective on an important time. And kind of, let me just add this. I mean, it puts into a different context the sort of idealized notion of the 50s as this placid, bland, peace and prosperity, and nothing was wrong. I mean, it's just a really kind of helpful, additional way to look at that period. Drew, I didn't mean to step on you there. Is that a fair summary? Or?
No, that's absolutely a fair statement. I was just so pleased that you saw that as an important part of the book. So thank you for that, and thank you for this conversation.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for watching another edition of our series. We will have this video on our website in the coming days. Please look at it and share it to family and friends. And thank you for supporting the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute and keeping the legacy of Paul Simon alive and well. Thank you so much.